Welcome back. This is our last session of the day, day 4 here at State of the World 2021. And we're going to close with a conversation with Congresswoman Karen Bass that was recorded yesterday because she got called into a meeting she learned yesterday with the speaker today at the time we had originally scheduled. She represents the 37th District of California and serves on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and is the chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations. She also serves on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Terrorism, and she is the past chair of the Congressional Black Caucus as well. She has a conversation with Paul Fagan, who is my friend and colleague at the McCain Institute, and let's go to that now.
Good afternoon. This is Paul Fagan. I'm with the McCain Institute. Very happy that you joined us today. We are very grateful, first of all, for our partners at Florida International University for hosting this and asking us to partner on this important event, the State of the World. We are today joined by Congresswoman Karen Bass, representing the 37th District of California, serving in she just won re-election for her 6th term. Representing the state of in Southern California since 2010, but you are no newcomer to politics, having served in the California State Assembly, rising to the speaker there, becoming the first African-American woman of any state assembly to hold that position, which is remarkable. And I think even more remarkable is one of the more remarkable bio points is that you also were a recipient of the JFK Freedom and Courage Award for your work with Governor Schwarzenegger and your bipartisan, way of dealing with your colleagues across the aisle. So many accolades, many awards, I'm sure. We're just so pleased to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Yeah. I am very happy to be here and very happy to work with the McCain Institute, as I have worked with the Institute on other issues as well.
Yeah, I know you've spoken at a symposium on human trafficking, so you're a big advocate in defeating the scourge of human trafficking around the world and also in our own backyard. So thank you for all the hard work that you do, not only for the citizens of California, but for Americans and people around the world, because you really are a leader in so many areas. Yeah. But I want to kind of just get off and get started. This is called State of the World. So we'd love to, get your opinions about, the state of democracy around the world, especially in the past year. We've been dealing with COVID, globally, but also here in our own country, our democracy was really tested, not only because of COVID. Mm-hmm. We obviously had the Black Lives Matter, going on throughout the year, then the controversy around our own elections, mm-hmm. and we were still able to hold elections. Millions of people went to the polls here in the United States, but also around the world. We saw people in Belarus stand up. We've seen people in Hong Kong stand up. So we'd love to hear your opinion about what's going on in the state of democracy around the world.
Well, absolutely. And I will say we're watching it right now in Russia. And then we're also watching Myanmar going the exact opposite direction. Yep. And so I think the state of democracy in the world is fragile. Mm-hmm. And I think that COVID has provided an excuse for many people around the world, many leaders around the world, to use that as an opportunity to backslide, as an opportunity to say, well, maybe we shouldn't have an election, or maybe we should be particularly forceful when we have that election in terms of suppressing opposition, et cetera. So I would describe it as fragile. And then I think the most unfortunate thing is that we have always been the beacon around the world. And people looked at our democracy and never, ever questioned that we would be fragile. And I think we've exposed something that was a shock to all of us, because I don't think any of us thought our democracy was fragile either. We didn't even really question it. However, there's always been an issue with our democracy in certain communities. So it's sad to say that even in 2021, in many communities, African-American community, other communities of color, we have never been fully franchised. And so the voter suppression, disenfranchisement of communities of color is something that I think got a lot of exposure to the world this time. And what I am, though, always very hopeful that moving forward, a lot of people recognize the fact that we had a fragile parts and that we'll strengthen it. So one of the things that we're working on here in the House is to push for passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because unfortunately a Supreme Court decision a few years ago made it much more difficult for many communities to have access to the ballot. But the Supreme Court told the legislative branch we needed to fix it. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act does that. And I'm hoping that that will be something that President Biden will sign in his first 100 days.
Let me link what's going on here in the United States to the world. I think it's really important, as you mentioned, Americans, oftentimes we, especially those serving in policy positions, government positions, when you're looking overseas, we used to criticize elections, everywhere, or endorse elections. Mm-hmm. And you hear leaders from around the world, you hear every day, people from around the world having witnessed what happened on January 6th, mm-hmm. and looking at our democracy, as you said, being more fragile than we all thought. Do we still have the moral authority to comment, to respond to, attacks on democracy around the world? Or how do we get back to a place where we have that moral authority?
Right, and I think it's a question that's in process right now. Mm-hmm. I do think we do still have the moral authority, but I believe this now more so, but I've always believed it. It's important for us to acknowledge our weaknesses. Mm-hmm. It's important for us to acknowledge that not everybody in the United States has had complete free access to the vote. And I think that it gives us higher, better moral authority when we admit what is going on. I think in the past, what we have always done has been very righteous, as though our democracy was flawless. Well, we obviously can't do that anymore. Now, I do think that we have damage. We need to do repair work. I think our moral authority will be much stronger in a couple of years, but we absolutely need to rectify what happened on January 6th, but also what's been happening the last few years. And then I think one of the things that's going to be very important about what happened January 6th is that we're going to need to do a deep and thorough investigation and prosecute those who essentially attacked the Capitol, those who conspired to participate in that attack, and then and recognize what that attack was about. That was an absolute attempt to change the results of an election. And I think it's important that we acknowledge it and we not sugarcoat it. And I emphasize that because there is definitely a viewpoint in this country today that is trying to minimize what actually happened. And I don't think that we should do that. I don't think that that's healthy for our democracy to act as though January 6th did not happen.
I would agree. On January 6th, we witnessed an attack on our democracy. And the images themselves, no matter how you parse it, so to speak, but the images around the world showed that our leadership was under attack. You were under attack. Your colleagues, the House and Senate were under attack, and the Vice President was under attack. And there needs to be accountability for all of that. And again, because we are talking about how this impacts our global relationships, our global viewpoint, and how others look at us. I want to bring it back to a little bit to what you're specifically doing on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where you've been a member since you entered Congress. You are now you have been the chairwoman of the Africa Subcommittee, which also handles global health and human rights. Can we talk about that as your role and some of your priorities heading into this new Congress?
Well, absolutely. And, I think for a while, all of our top three priorities are going to be COVID.
Yes.
And so because we have been, in my opinion, a little absent from international leadership, we need to reestablish that. And we need to reestablish that with COVID. And the issue that is going to come up right away is vaccine distribution and making sure that it is an equitable distribution, rejoining the World Health Organization and participating in an international way. So, for example, when the pandemic was first being recognized, what I would have hoped would have happened is we should have essentially addressed it as the leader of the free world, similar to what happened with Ebola, because Ebola could have been a pandemic. It was not a pandemic because we stepped forward as the United States, mobilized the entire world, and stamped it out. And actually, Ebola never really left Africa in a significant way and didn't even really spread in Africa very significantly in 3 countries, and there's 54 countries on the continent. That's the kind of leadership we have displayed in the past. That's the kind of leadership we need to display right now. And I'm hopeful that we will do that. And I think if we reestablish our international leadership around COVID, that will help address some of the issues we were just talking about.
I think you raised a really good point about leadership and American leadership in areas where we have historically led, whether it is around democracy, whether it is around global health. And our COVID response really has been criticized. And hopefully, we can become that leader again. Mm-hmm. We have now returned to the WHO. Can you speak to our leadership, what we can do working with the WHO? There is criticism of the WHO,
Sure.
So can you talk a little bit about, how we can, constructively work with WHO, but at the same time talk about, reforming WHO and how it works globally? Because we've seen some of the flaws.
Yes, and you know what? This is really an issue because we can't send the message to the world that every time we have a transition of leadership that our policy wildly changes. And so, for example, I can't think of an international body that you don't have criticism of. But is the way you respond by pulling out, cutting off funding when everybody knows we're the primary funder in many international organizations around the world? Is that the way to bring about change? And so I think that we need to examine what has happened in the WHO, but we should begin by rejoining. We should begin by restoring funding and then have the conversation. It's just not a way to address things. So in the middle of a pandemic, we pull out of the World Health Organization. I've never understood how that made sense.
Yeah, I would tend to, I don't mean to sound tongue-tied, but yes, in the middle of a pandemic, that seemed a very interesting decision to pull out. But we are back. And I think, as you said, we need to take these leadership roles that we have in the past, where we have led on Ebola, where we have led on malaria, where we have led on polio and HIV, which brings me to this point. You bring it up again, where we've been leaders in combating HIV, especially in Africa, where this has been such a bipartisan effort. Right. As a leader on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Subcommittee for Africa and Global Health, how can you work with your colleagues across the aisle to move on COVID globally? I know we are focused so much in our own country, right, but how can you and your colleagues work together to ensure that there is this equity in vaccine distribution? Because I think a lot of us see that that's going to be a big issue over the next year, and how people get vaccinated around the world.
Well, I will tell you that I'm hopeful because of the history of our committee. It has been a bipartisan committee. And so I am hopeful that will allow us to address these issues. But I do have to say a word of caution. Number one, our committees are just being formed. Right. And I'm not exactly sure how it's going to function this year, especially in regard to COVID, when you have an analysis of COVID out there that blames one country as being in charge, responsible, and especially very critical. And I'm referring to China. And so the question will be, will that color how we address COVID, or will we be able to address this issue the way we have historically in our committee, from a bipartisan manner and addressing that the best way to serve U.S. leadership is not in a way where we are attacking other countries, but looking for cooperation.
Yeah, and I'm going to dive a little deeper on your cooperation in the past on the committee, but the broader committee and the subcommittee, where I know you've enjoyed, great relationships with your colleagues on your side and the other side. Since you are the chairwoman of the committee that focuses on Africa, how, those of us in the sort of the policy advocacy community that focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, we often hear, it's a reset on Africa policy. We're going to focus on Africa. And oftentimes, there are some policy movements. But where do you see the priorities and how we can continue to advance relationships on the continent so these relationships seem more real and enduring rather than maybe transactional and momentary, just for the moment?
Well, absolutely. And I will tell you that we started actually last week by doing a call with all of the ambassadors from the African continent. Here in Washington, D.C., there is an office. The African Union has an office. And so we invited them to all participate on a Zoom call. And the purpose of that was to listen to what they had to say, what their priorities were. And that was a way of signaling, number one, our respect, the fact that we think there is going to be a reset and we will prioritize Africa. But I will just tell you that the experience of the last few years, the best way to describe it has been confusing to a lot of our international partners, where they would reach out to us pretty regularly and try to say, what is the U.S. policy? It seems to be changing a lot. And so really it's the stability and establishing communications and finding out what others' priorities are and trying to address it from a point of view of partnership. So I am hopeful. I'm very excited personally about the subcommittee on Africa, because there is a lot of interest in it this time. So I'm hoping that our bipartisanship will continue.
And where do you personally see some priorities? I know you want to remain hopeful, and I'm in the same boat. I'm an eternal optimist, and you want to focus on the good news stories and how we can ensure progress. But there are some places on the continent that are regressing, and I look at Uganda right now and the election that they just held, and how can we continue to have a close strategic working relationship with Uganda and others that we have these security relationships where democracy is really backsliding and human rights issues are at the forefront. And how can you as the committee chairwoman kind of tackle what's happening in Uganda and other places that are facing the same challenges?
Well, it might sound simple, but I do think the mere fact of being present, the mere fact of speaking up, speaking out, calling attention to is very, very important, because I think that people have felt an absence of our presence. And so I think that is the first step. And to continue to engage the leaders, to promote democracy and good governance. Again, it's hard when the budgets for democracy and governance are slashed significantly, or when we pass legislation and funding and it's not implemented. And so that's the first order of business from my perspective, is number one, making sure that there is adequate funding for democracy and governance, and making sure that the legislation that we push for is implemented. So it's really for us to stabilize things in our own house while we re-engage the world, and specifically the African continent. A few other priorities, though, is really looking at infrastructure on the continent of Africa. And so anytime you have a pandemic, anytime you have a health epidemic, looking at the health infrastructure on the continent of Africa. What can we do as Americans to strengthen that infrastructure? And then I've always been interested in changing our paradigm for foreign aid that to me has like a charity focus. We give to other countries because they don't have the capacity. And I just don't believe that countries don't have the capacity. And I want to see us shift our paradigm away from that to support the countries so that they can deliver services on their own, not provided by us or outside, foreign contractors. But what can we do to support the development of a health infrastructure, education infrastructure, et cetera?
I know our time is limited, and I want to kind of focus on a couple of the points you made in your last comment. You represent the people of California. You represent the people of the United States. Oftentimes, Americans don't quite understand why we're investing in places in Africa, Latin America, Asia, around the world. How do you sort of convince your constituents and the American constituents that this is worthwhile, this is in our strategic interest, this is in our best interests? And be, mindful of that we have a student audience, amongst us right now. So I think they would very much appreciate your words of why this is so important to America.
Well, I think, first of all, as Americans in our American culture, we don't know very much about the rest of the world. As you know, when you travel overseas, you will meet people who know all about the United States, and you're not sure very much as to where the capital of the country is. And so I consider it my job to educate my constituents about internationalism, about the world. All you need is COVID is to understand why we have to be connected in the world. I mean, in the matter of a month, all of our lives changed dramatically last year on the entire planet. Why? Because the planet Earth is very small with communications and travel the way it is. And so our health, our well-being, our prosperity is completely linked to people around the world. And using COVID as a perfect example of how we're all linked. This virus, we will not overcome this virus until we overcome it as a planet. So for example, there's vaccines that are available now. I'm very excited about that. But we're also learning about new strains. Until you stamp COVID out in the world, you can't just stamp it out in the United States because the new strains will continue to mutate. So using what we're going through right now is a perfect example to explain why we are completely connected, and our health, well-being, and prosperity is connected and depends on the health, prosperity, and well-being of other countries as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the COVID, we have all sort of, I don't say become equalized, but all of us are now on Zoom, and we are participating in a way that we never have, that has allowed us to maybe communicate even more. So it's in one respect, I think our connectivity to other communities has grown, but it's also shown just how impactful one disease is to the whole entire world, and how it has collapsed on all of us.
I mean, what could you think of? What experience could you think of that everyone in the world is going
being impacted
at the same time? It's incredible.
No, it is incredible. And we have, and I think kind of, what you said too earlier is this issue around American leadership and getting back to, American leadership on finding, a solution to all of this. But we need to do it with partnership. With our European partners, our Asian partners, our African partners, Latin American partners, because as you mentioned, this disease is mutating faster than we know. So we need to all be on the same page. We are coming to the end of this discussion, and I want you to have the opportunity to kind of talk to our student population. If there are messages that you would want to deliver to our late teens, early 20s, about the future and how you see the future, the state of the world in the next year, in the next 2 years. What are some of the things that they need to prioritize?
Well, first of all, the youth of our country absolutely give me all the hope in the world, because you have so much opportunity that's right at your footstep. I mean, some of the things that are challenging to us today, like social media, the ability to communicate, and now the whole Zoom environment, actually presents a tremendous opportunity for all of you. And I hope that you come up with the most productive, healthy, positive ways to do that, to use technology to bring about positive change to move our country forward. And your leadership is desperately needed now. Age should never be a factor. If you look at the history of the world, every time there were major social movements that brought about really positive change, they were always led by young people. So we count on you. The other thing that I would really hope that you consider is public service and a job in government. If any of you are interested in foreign service, I think the State Department over the next few years is going to have a number of openings, and maybe you'll consider that, because the world is such an exciting place, and I hope that you are able to experience it very early in your academic and professional careers.
I'm glad you said that. Many people, interns have, always asked me, about career advice, especially being in Washington. I say, go work in the government. Find out what it's like to work there, or, whatever branch of government, military. I have not done it, but I always tell people to do it. But I feel like living in Washington, you can't get away from it. So I think that's the perfect message to end on, that, our, young generation really should understand how government works. We need to kind of get back to basics and understanding elections. As you said, you mentioned, this year really, we've focused on our voting rights, how people are voting.
Right.
It was at front and center. Our democracy was more so than any other time in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So very important words to end on. Is there anything else you would like to end on for the state of the world?
Yeah, the only thing that I want to say
Yep.
is that it is definitely, when there's things that you complain about in the government, it really is everyone's responsibility. And part of our American culture is we vote and then we go home. I would just ask you, as an elected official, vote and stay involved with your elected officials, please, because it's our collective responsibility to make sure that our system works.
Absolutely. I'm going to end it there.
Thank you.
Thank you on behalf of the McCain Institute, Florida International, David Kramer, my colleague in crime and all of this. We couldn't have had a better guest today. Congresswoman Bass, representing the 37th District of California. Thanks so much.
Very welcome.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul, and Congresswoman Bass. We're grateful for you to take the time to do that with Paul. Extremely important and great note to end on as well. This brings us to a close for day 4. We still have one more day to go. And we have some great panels tomorrow. We're going to look at the fight against corruption and kleptocracy, an incredibly important issue. And then we turn to Africa. We'll then look at the Americas, and we'll wrap up with a panel focused on the all-important issue of climate change. So please be sure to join us tomorrow. We start bright and early once again, 9 a.m., no rest for the weary. And let me also just say an enormous thanks to all my colleagues who have put this program together. Couldn't happen without you. And look forward to seeing you all for our final day tomorrow. Thanks, and we'll see you then.